Greetings to all our learners. Welcome to CEC lecture. Dear learners, the topic of analysis for today is G77 and Global Politics. In this lecture, we shall analyze how G77, its aims, objectives, structure, functioning over the years has played a very important role with respect to factoring in voices of the developing country for global trade. We shall also try to understand the role of G77 with respect to issues that were there with the working of GATT rounds, issues that are there with the current structure and the outcomes of the working of WTO UNCTAD amongst others. This lecture shall present an analysis of the aims and objectives of G77. It shall also highlight dynamics and other institutional apparatus involved in global trade rule. We shall also try to look at important trade theories, and most important, trying to situate the issues that are there for G77 and as well as for other global governance mechanism with respect to their structure and issues involved in functioning. To begin with, we must understand that trade involves exchanging goods and services between two people or entities, nations. Now, when we look at international trade, dear learners, international trade implies exchange between people or entities in two different countries. This brings us to the other important question. Why trade? Because there is a belief that exchange shall lead to benefit. Now, in order to understand trade, especially with the focus on global trade, there are various theories there. A quick look of the major theories of international trade. The theory of absolute advantage was presented by Adam Smith. Adam Smith, in his work, questions the mercantile theory. In his book, The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith, he tries to present an inquiry into nature and causes of the wealth of nations. And the new trade perspective was that of absolute advantage. Now, what does this absolute advantage implies? It is ability of a country to produce a good more efficiently than other nations, and most important, that trade should flow naturally. The perspective from laissez-faire that trade between countries shouldn't be regulated. In contrast to the perspective of theory of absolute advantage, we have the another perspective, that of comparative advantage. This is from the work of David Ricardo, an English economist who introduced the theory of comparative advantage in 1817. That is, even if country A has the absolute advantage in the production of both products, specialization and trade could still occur between two countries. Now, as we are trying to understand why nations trade, we must also factor in two important aspects. First, international trade, dear learners, it's complex. It is impacted by numerous and often changing factors. The second perspective is that of the North-South divide. Now, why are we talking about North-South divide with respect to international trade? Because this is where the assumptions of group of 77 comes up. The group of 77, called as G77, abbreviated as G77, dear learners, it was established on 15 June 1964 by 77 then developing countries who were signatories of the Joint Declaration of the 77 developing countries. This was issued at the end of the first session of United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. When we read further for our learnings, taking inputs from the authentic first resources, the primary source from G77.org, we get to understand that it was a means for the countries of the South to articulate and promote their collective economic interests, enhance their joint negotiating capacity on all major international economic issues within the United Nations system, and also promote South-South cooperation for development. So one gets the sense that G77, it is a creation of unity amongst diversity, because the then countries who were signatories to the Joint Declaration, and even in present times, countries with respect to their global trade agenda are diverse. So G77 is not a homogeneous group. There are common economic problems, social environment, and G77 tries to get the broad setting of objectives to address common problems. Now, as we are trying to understand G77, one must also understand intergovernmental organization. Dear learners, intergovernmental organization refers to an entity created by treaty involving two or more nations to work in good faith on issues of common interest. Now, in the absence of a treaty, an intergovernmental organization does not exist in legal sense. For example, G8, which is a group of 8 nations that have annual economic and political summits. Reading further from this very interesting perspective that we get from harvard.edu, that is, intergovernmental organizations are formed by treaties. They are more advantageous than mere groupings of nations because they are subject to international law. They have the ability to enter enforceable agreements amongst themselves or with states. The group of 77 that we are analyzing, it is the largest intergovernmental organization of the developing countries in the United Nations. G77 provides the means for countries of the South to articulate and promote their collective economic interests, as we just saw, and also attempt to enhance their joint negotiating capacity on major international economic issues. The first session of United Nations Conference on Trade and Development in Geneva, beginning with the ministerial meeting of the Group of 77 in Algiers on 10 to 25 October 1967, this adopted the Charter of Algiers. A prominent, and a permanent institutional structure gradually developed. If we look at the history and the evolution of G77, this led to the creation of chapters of groups of 77 with liaison offices as in Geneva, Nairobi with UNEP, Paris, UNESCO, Rome with Food and Agriculture Organization, Vienna with UNIDO. And what we see here is that although the members of G77 have increased over a period of time, however, this original name G77 has been retained due to its historic significance. Let's understand G77 now with respect to other international trade governance apparatus. The first one, when we look at the historical point of view, from 1948 to 1994, the GATT provided rules for world trade, which was like a provisional agreement, and it aimed to create an institution to handle the trade side of international economic cooperation, joining the two Bretton Woods institutions, namely the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Dear learners, it is very important to understand that WTO, which was established during the Uruguay round of GATT negotiation, which subsumed GATT, WTO provides a permanent arena for member governments to address international trade issues. What is essential to be factored here in that what the then Joint Declaration of 15 June 1964, signed by the representatives of the member states of Group of 77 participating in the conference, what they jointly presented, the raison d'etre for the establishment of G77, those issues in the field of trade and development are all the more essential today. Namely, looking at the raison d'etre of G77 as the joint statement reads, and we quote from there, the developing countries attach singular importance to the establishment of international machinery in the field of trade and development. Quoting further, that it is vitally necessary that this machinery should be an effective instrument for the discussion of issues, formulation of policies, review of results, and for taking operational measures as and when needed in sphere of international economic relations. To read further, the developing countries attach cardinal importance to democratic procedures which afford no position of privilege in the economic and financial, no less than the political sphere. And reading further, the developing countries have a strong conviction that there is a vital need to maintain and strengthen further this unity in the years ahead, that it is an indispensable instrument for securing adoption of new attitudes, new approaches in international economic field. This unity is also instrument for enlarging area of cooperative endeavor in international field and for securing mutually beneficial relations with the rest of the world. One can find this joint declaration at G77.org. Further, what we see here is that now when we look at G77, the WTO in the present time is not just transformed into formal international organization. We must take into account that today international trade is complex. So WTO covers a broader purview, namely subsidies, tariffs and non-tariff barriers, intellectual property amongst others. But with respect to issues of developing countries, it has been pointed out that it is G77 which is the most important coalition as well as an intergovernmental organization within the UN system to factor in the concerns of the developing world. Now, let's have an understanding over some of the activities that G77, the actions, the work G77 has taken in. Once again, reading from the web source G77.org, that is, it has produced joint declarations, action programs, agreements on specific topics such as the LGU's topic charter in 1967, the Lima Declaration 1971, Manila Declaration 1976, Arusha Program for Self-Reliance and Framework for Negotiation 1979, Caracas Program of Action on ECDC 1981, Cairo Declaration on ECDC 1986, the Havana Declaration 1987, the Caracas Declaration 1989, Tehran Declaration 1991 were some of the important activities G77 has undertaken. Now, when we look at the structure of G77, it has a chairman. The chairman acts as its spokesperson, coordinates the group's action in each chapter. The chairmanship, which is the highest political body within the organizational structure of Group of 77, it rotates on a regional basis between Africa, Asia Pacific, Latin America, Caribbean, and is also held for 1 year in all the chapters. Now, one has to see that how over a period of time G77 has worked very effectively for the concerns of the developing world. When we look in the present year 2021, it is the Republic of Guyana that holds the chairmanship of the Group of 77 in New York for the year 2021. Periodically, when we try to analyze the structure, we must factor in there are sectoral, ministerial meetings In preparation for UNCTAD sessions, general conferences of UNIDO, UNESCO are convened, and special ministerial meetings are also called as and when needed. Further, G77 has done some great work in the realm of publications also. When we look at Journal of the Group of 77, periodical newsletter published in England, Guide to ECDC, Supplement to ECDC Handbook 1983, Economic and Technical Cooperation among Developing Countries, the Group of 77 in Action, which was there over 2 volumes in 1984. So, it has also contributed in the thought process also with respect to issues of global trade and development, international economic relations from the vantage point of the concerns of the developing countries. Further, when we try to take our learnings forward, this is very important book by Murad Ahmia, that is Group of 77 at the United Nations, Environment and Sustainable Development. Now, this book is very important because it gives us some very important chronological record of the events, the documents of the Group of 77 since its creation, and there are position papers, other major documents which are related specially to environment and sustainable development. Further, South Summit, it is the supreme decision making body of the Group of 77. The first and the second South Summits were held in Havana, Cuba on 10th to 14th April 2000 and in Doha, Qatar in 2005 respectively. The annual meetings of the Ministers for Foreign Affairs of Group of 77 is convened at the beginning of the regular session of the General Assembly of the United Nations in New York. Now, in order to pursue South-South cooperation, starting in 1995, the group also convened a series of sectoral meetings. Let's have a look at some important sectoral meetings, namely sectoral review meeting in the field of energy, that was at Jakarta in 1995, high-level conference on sub-regional and regional economic cooperation among developing countries, that was at Bali, Indonesia, 1998. Further, some contemporary perspectives, as we all saw that the world witnessed the COVID-19 crisis. Now, in this perspective, Group of 77 has called for strengthening the South-South as well as North-South cooperation. It has applauded the UN's effort and the idea of UN COVID-19 Response and Recovery Fund. It called for coordinated multi-agency, multi-sectoral approach to address socio-economic impacts of COVID-19 crisis, and calls for greater sharing of information technology for the detection, prevention, treatment and control of the pandemic. Now, this is from the recent perspectives that have been presented by Group of 77. Now, when we also are trying to analyze G77, we must also understand that India, since 1960s, it has played a very important role for issues of the developing world, and since the 1960s, G77 has demanded greater participation in international politics, that where negotiation should lead to international agreements that enhance development possibilities. India, reading from the current statements, that India is a member of G77, but also we must take into account that it also holds independent positions since 2009, and it has also been an important player at other various international forums also. Quoting from this very important remarks by India's permanent representative to the UN Ambassador T.S. Tirumurthy, saying at the 44th annual meeting of G77 foreign ministers that India and G77 annual ministerial meeting, when we try to understand that, very important perspective coming forward, that in India's development cooperation, we will be guided by our partners' development priorities. Our assistance does not create indebtedness and is without conditionalities. Now, these are the very significant remarks by India's permanent representative to the UN, Ambassador T.S. Tirumurthy, at the 44th annual meeting of G77 foreign ministers. Now, dear learners, as we are trying to understand G77, we must also see very important perspective that we get how over a period of time G77 has played a pivotal role in shaping priorities, driving change on challenge after challenge, and it, as the words of UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres comes forward, that there must be full engagement and strong support of the reform agenda across the UN's work in management, peace, security and development. We all know that world has witnessed various phases of globalization. Now, in the present time, when we are in the phase of technological globalization, therein there are further issues which have been raised, that one must look at the important aspect, that is trade, investment, finance, wherein technology must be used in an inclusive and sustainable development sense. Time and again, the G77 has emerged as the important forum for the developing countries to harmonize their views. After UNCTAD, it is G77 which is the forum for developing countries to put forward their views on global economic issues. Further, as we are trying to understand the G77, we must also see that working of G77 and its analysis, therefore, it is very much linked to the entire aspect of international public goods and related. Taking words from the remarks by Mukchand Dubey, former Foreign Secretary, Government of India, that the working of G77 is embedded in the United Nations. Its impact and effectiveness and its achievements and failures have to be largely seen dependent on the rise and fall and success and failure of the United Nations. So, dear learners, issues of trade are complex. G77, which is a coalition of developing nations designed to promote its members' collective economic interests, creating enhanced joint negotiation capacity in the United Nations, there has been a call that it must continue to play crucial role as the standard bearer for the interests of all developing countries. Its role at various forums from UNCTAD to others, so over the year, over 5 decades has been of unparalleled work on trade and development that has stood the test of the time. What is needed, it must build on this foundation to deliver meaningful trade and development outcomes for the people and for nations. Dear learners, we hope that the lecture on G77 and global politics gave you significant inputs and insights. We look forward to positive, encouraging feedback from you all. Thank you very much for being with us.